Are you making any of these 6 mistakes when growing Agave Utahensis? That's what we're talking about today. The top 6 mistakes that can be made when growing Agave Utahensis and how to avoid them. So the first mistake when growing Agave Utahensis that we're going to be going over today is choosing the wrong soil mix. Right? When you're choosing a soil mix for Agave Utahensis, there's a number of things you want to consider, but one of the biggest ones is that soil mix be very well draining. You see, we want to be able to water our Agave Utahensis pretty frequently. We're actually going to talk about that in a little bit in this video, but we want to also make sure that plant dries out, that soil that the plant is sitting in dries out in between each of those waterings. And if you're using a well-draining soil, that's going to be a lot easier because at first, any excess water you pour into the soil during watering will just drain out the bottom of a very well-draining soil. And then additionally, most very well-draining soils will allow the water to evaporate pretty quickly because you don't want the soil in that pot that your plant is sitting in to stay wet for days or weeks at a time. So a well-draining soil mix will generally be comprised of some large percentage of inorganic material, pumice, lava rocks, turfus, stuff like that, whatever is available in your area generally. I actually have a whole video detailing this, so if you want more detail, go check out my soil mix video. But those inorganic components will generally have a pretty large particle size, right? Which means there's a lot of air in the soil, and that's how the water will evaporate. That'll also confer a sort of secondary benefit that can help you prevent a major mistake when growing Agave Utahensis, because you see, Agave Utahensis has a very fibrous root system. That means its roots there's a lot of little tiny, very fine, thin roots, that grow under the agave plant, and those roots need to be able to expand. And if your soil is, really sandy, it's got a lot of really small particles and it compacts down really, really hard after being in a pot for a little while, the roots aren't going to be able to expand into that soil mix in the way that they would want to. So using a well-draining soil mix will ensure that there's the right amount of moisture in the pot for the right amount of time, but it'll also ensure that your roots have the looseness of the soil that they require to be able to expand properly. The other side of that, though, is that you shouldn't be afraid when choosing the right soil mix for Agave Utahensis to include some organic content material, right? A lot of folks who grow cactuses and then start growing agaves will be thinking in the cactus mindset and will just use a either 100% or inorganic material mix, just all lava rocks or all pumice or something along those lines, or something with very, very little organic material in it. And for Agave Utahensis, in a lot of cases, I think that's a mistake. That's the wrong kind of soil mix. Agave Utahensis, in its habitat, and some of its healthiest habitats, grows in what's called a mollisoil, which is basically very high organic material content. So basically there's a lot of trees and leaves and sticks and roots of other plants that have died and are now decaying in the soil, which creates a very fertile soil called the mollisoil. And in most places that fertile, high organic content mollisoil is mixed with inorganic gravel, generally in the form of limestone. So the first mistake to avoid when growing Agave Utahensis is choosing the wrong soil mix. The right soil mix is something that's going to be well draining, which means that it has a large percentage, 50%, 40%, 60%, somewhere in that range of inorganic material of a fairly large particle size, but does also have some organic content material. One of my favorite ways to incorporate organic content material into an Agave Utahensis soil mix is through using worm casings. And then the second mistake when growing Agave Utahensis is to underwater or overwater your Agave Utahensis plant. I start by saying that underwatering is the bigger mistake because that's probably much more likely. Because again, when folks are coming from the cactus space or the cactus mindset, growing a lot of cactus, and then start growing Agave Utahensis, they're probably thinking that they're probably much more concerned about overwatering their Agave Utahensis, right? Agave Utahensis is not a cactus. It is a succulent plant, right? And it can actually take quite a bit of watering. There are studies that show on other forms of agave species that show that the more water an agave is given, the faster its growth rate. And in fact, I water my Agave Utahensis very, very frequently, and they show wonderful growth rates that I'm super duper happy about. The flip side of that coin, though, is overwatering. And to clarify, I don't think it's necessarily possible to overwater your Agave Utahensis. I've done a bunch of studies on both sides of this coin personally, experiments I've done, where I've overwatered plants, given them a lot of water every time I water them much more frequently than I would normally, and then just sort of not watered them for months on end. In both cases, they'll survive, but we're trying to have ideal growth here. So the concern with underwatering is just that you want to make sure you give your Agave Utahensis as much water as you can, and what as you can means in this context is while you're ensuring that the agave soil that we just talked about dries out in between each watering, right? That's what it would mean to overwater an Agave Utahensis, would be to leave the agave roots wet the whole time. That'll build up algae, green algae in the soil, which generally speaking isn't probably going to be such a huge deal. But eventually, if the plant does never dry out, you probably could get some rotting, particularly if the temperatures got a little colder, something like that. So the second mistake when growing Agave Utahensis is giving it improper water. Generally, underwatering it is going to be a bigger concern than overwatering it, but both can be a problem. And I've done a whole video on the proper way to water your Agave Utahensis and to really dial in the amount of water you're giving it. So go check out that video if you want to find out more information about that in detail. The third mistake when growing or collecting Agave Utahensis that we're going to talk about today is not buying seed-grown plants. Right, the alternative would be wild harvested plants. And of course, I've talked about in other videos that not every wild grown plant is in fact poached, because poaching is a crime and it is possible to legally wild collect plants. Whether or not that is ethical is an entirely different story. But at the end of the day, if you're into plants, if you like Agave Utahensis, you should probably want to be doing something to the world population of Agave Utahensis that increases their numbers rather than decreases or just keeps them static. And the only way to ensure that you're doing that is to buy seed grown. The other reason that you want to make sure you're buying seed grown is unless you're doing all the due diligence and you're doing the legwork and you're very comfortable with the seller that you're buying the plants from. If you're buying wild collected plants, it can be very difficult to know if those wild collected plants have been poached or if they've been legally collected but unethically legally wild collected. The other problem with buying wild collected plants is that a lot of times, as Kelly and I talked about in my interview with him, they're not going to be taken care of in the same way that a seed-grown plant is. Generally, when a plant is dug up from the wild, it has to have its roots all chopped up. Those roots may or may not have then been placed in an ideal soil mix, because again, if those plants are then put into a very sandy soil mix, the roots are not going to really have an opportunity to grow back. And then the habitat conditions that plant is grown for many years, potentially multiple decades in, if it's a wild grown plant, are you going to be able to really duplicate that in your growing environment, right? Because again, it's been growing up at altitude where it gets a ton of UV stress, but the temperatures are fairly mild. Are you really going to be able to give it that kind of conditions? A lot of these wild collected plants, even if they're legally wild collected, have a really high, and it's an unfortunate, mortality rate. They don't really make it all the time. Versus seed-grown plants, how you can ask the seller how they've been grown, how they've been cultivated. The roots aren't going to be all damaged when you get them. They're going to be much healthier. They're going to be much easier to grow, much easier to keep alive for a long time. And in my thinking, my opinion, seed-grown plants, because they've been grown like the way I grow them, under a lot of high-power LED lighting, with the right amount of water, the right airflow, et cetera, I think they actually end up looking a lot cooler because they have better spine development, better leaf color, et cetera, than a lot of these, unfortunately wild collected plants. And by the way, if you want to buy some of my seed-grown plants, I sell them over on my website at mojave.lv. So the fourth mistake when growing or collecting Agave Utahensis is related to the last one. It's about misidentifying or mislabeling Agave Utahensis varieties. There are a ton of either uninformed or unscrupulous Agave Utahensis sellers online that are lying about the specific variety of Agave Utahensis that they're selling. There are some cases where plants that are definitely not Eborospina are labeled as being Eborospina plants and are being sold simply because Eborospina can sell for more money and typically sells faster. And then there are other cases where, for various search engine optimization type of reasons, plants are labeled as, they have both Utahensis, Nevadensis, and Eborospina, and everything else in the description of the plant. And so when you're buying a plant, And when you're looking at your plants in collection and cultivation, you should be really careful to correctly identify which variety of Agave Utahensis this is. If it's Nevadensis, if it's Iborospina, if it's just regular Utahensis, or even if it's Cababensis. All of these varieties are super cool, right? And there should be love for all of them, but quite unfortunately, I see a lot of cases where collectors, sellers, etc., are misidentifying Agave Utahensis plants, generally labeling them as Iborospina when they are absolutely anything but. I made a whole video about this, are you being lied to about Agave Utahensis Iborospina? But what it basically boils down to is that according to Howard Scott Gentry's book, Agaves of Continental North America, Iborospina has terminal spines of 4 inches or more. And that's generally going to mean that the terminal spine is like probably the same length as the leaf itself. If that's not the case, if you're looking at a plant and those spines are less than 4 inches, I don't think that's 4 inches, but if they're less than 4 inches, then it's not Agave Utahensis Iborospina. And the reason that I say that this misidentification problem is related to the last one about buying seed-grown plants is because if you're buying seed-grown plants, you're gonna be much more sure that the seller has correctly labeled the plants, right? I only sell right now Nevadensis seedlings, but I do have Iborospina and Cababensis coming soon, and I am 1000% sure that's actually what they are, and you can trust that as well because I've grown them from seed. The other problem, the other flip side of that coin is if you're buying it from a seller online who is lying to you about whether or not it's Iborospina or is just simply misinformed, and it's a wild harvested plant, can you really be sure that they're telling you the truth about where that came from, the legality, the ethics, etc.? So understanding and not misidentifying or not buying misidentified Agave Utahensis plants is really important and could be a big mistake that you should avoid. The fifth mistake when growing Agave Utahensis is actually going to be under lighting it, right? Lighting is a really important thing for Agave Utahensis, generally where it grows, and I made a video about this recently as well, but where it grows up in habitat, it's up at elevation, and at higher elevations, there's actually more UV radiation that hits the plants, right? They also don't grow in environments where there is a ton of, tree cover overhead. There are plants that do grow under nurse plants or even nurse rocks in some cases, when a crack in a rock face when the plant is really little, the rock face is going to kind of overhang it and give it some shadow. But generally speaking, plants in habitat are up high altitude and they're getting full sun. So they're getting a ton of UV stress. And the reason that this for us in cultivation is so important is not because giving an Agave Utahensis less than ideal light is going to kill the plant. It's not. I have plenty of examples personally of plants that are grown in less than ideal conditions. I do a ton of experiments and tests on my own plants to kind of see what changes the forms and how plants grow in different conditions. And one of the things I found is that you can put an Agave Utahensis plant just sort of on a windowsill and it will be fine. It's not going to die. It's not going to shrivel up and disappear. It's not, though, going to look its absolute best. It's not going to have super blue leaves. It's not going to grow really fast. It's also not going to have the best spines and teeth that you probably are looking for. And in fact, and I've talked about this test a few times, but when I take seedlings grown from the same exact seed batch, which means that they're very similar genetics, they're all Nevadensis when I did this test, and they came from the same parent plants, right? And I take some of them and I put them in my normal indoor setup with lots of high power LED lights, lots of UV exposure. And then I put some of them outside. The plants that I put outside, I have to put under shade cloth because it gets super hot. And we're actually going to talk about temperature in a second here. But then when you look at those plants, the plants that got less light because they were under a shade cloth looked basically totally different than the plants that got a ton of light because they were grown inside under high power LED lighting, right? They tend to be the outdoor plants with less light, tend to be greener, they tend to be much smaller, they tend to have less root development, they tend to have less spine and teeth development, etc. So making sure you're providing the correct, the ideal, I don't want to say the correct, but the ideal amount of light for your Agave Utahensis to make it look as awesome as it possibly can is going to be really important. And that's a mistake if you're trying to grow a really cool looking plant, Agave Utahensis plant, that's a mistake you'll probably want to avoid is underlighting your plant. And the sixth and final mistake when growing Agave Utahensis is related to lighting, because as I said with lighting, you really want to make sure you're giving your plants enough light because up in habitat, they're getting a ton of UV exposure. But you also have to remember that up in habitat, they are up in habitat, right? They live in sky islands. They live thousands of feet in the air above sea level, which means that temperatures are much more moderate than they are, say, here in the valley in Las Vegas. Up in habitat where a lot of these plants are growing, even in the heat of the summer, the extreme heat of the summer, it rarely gets above 100 degrees. And a lot of times it barely even gets above 90 degrees. So when you're trying to give your plants as much light as possible, the easy thing to do, or the first thing you might think to do, is just to stick the plant outside in a full sun area. If it's a young plant or it's not acclimated to that, that will melt a plant very, very quickly. And I've done that to a bunch of plants personally. So that's a big mistake you want to avoid. When you're giving your plant as much light as possible, you want to make sure you're controlling the heat, because Agave Utahensis is the most cold hardy agave, right? It can handle the coldest temperatures. It cannot handle the hottest temperatures, right? It is more of a cold adapted agave. So when giving it a lot of UV exposure, if that's outside, you're probably going to need to be using greenhouses or shade cloth, something along that. If you're growing it inside, generally human temperatures, in the 70s and 80s and stuff like that are going to be fine for Agave Utahensis. If you want to go a step further, I always recommend fans for Agave Utahensis for a lot of reasons, not the least of which being it speeds up drying time so that you can actually water more frequently, which will produce faster growth rates, but it'll also help to control temperatures, because again, the sixth mistake here, the last mistake that we're talking about, is allowing your Agave Utahensis to melt because you've overheated them. So I want to hear down in the comments from you, what are the mistakes that you've made while growing Agave Utahensis or other forms of agave? Thanks for watching.